This is the second lecture for March 30th, Monday, March 30th, and today, in the second part of this lecture, we're going to talk about rocky shore zonation. So we're going to look at the upper intertidal, which means far away from the water, where organisms experience a lot of exposure and less submergence. Middle intertidal, obviously in between, and then the lower intertidal, where life is relatively easy physically. You don't have to tolerate being out of the water very much. You're submerged a lot more. However, with that easy way of life, it's easy for all kinds of different organisms. And then there's this mad scramble to be able to eke out an existence there, to be able to attach yourself to the rocks. And so there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of predator-prey interactions. And we're going to, we would go to our own rocky intertidal, and you'd see the types of organisms that are there. The point that I want to make now is that if you go to the Washington or Oregon or California, we have these rocky shores. If you went up to Maine, if you went to Australia, South America, all these different rocky shores, they don't have the same species in these rocky shores, but they have species that are very similar traits, very similar characteristics, which is exactly what you would expect because of the necessity for existing in these ecosystems requires you to deal with desiccation and temperature and waves crashing and being able to attach to the rocks. So you have different species, but you have similar characteristics amongst these different species. So that's what you see. This zonation that we're going to look at, we're not even mentioning specific species because it varies depending on where you are. But those species that you find have similar characteristics. So in terms of these three different zones, then the upper intertidal is up by the high tide mark when the water comes in. Of course, the level that the water reaches at high tide varies with the tidal cycle. But there's organisms that spend a lot of time being exposed and less time being underwater up in the upper intertidal. The middle intertidal, it's an intermediate level of exposure and submergence. The lower intertidal, or the low tide, to be actually in the intertidal means you're in the water and out of the water. So below the lowest low tide, then you're not really in the intertidal anymore. You're underwater all the time. So what I want to do is go through the upper intertidal, reinforce what kind of conditions you find there. We've already looked at this somewhat, and the main thing is that you're exposed more, so there's more that you have to deal with in terms of desiccation and temperature, terrestrial predators. You have to be able to tolerate these extreme conditions all the way down to the lower intertidal. So we'll look at each one of these three intertidal zones, and then we'll see what the characteristics are again, and we'll see what kind of organisms you find there. These organisms are the ones that are very good at tolerating those conditions and thriving in those type of physical conditions and dealing with those biological challenges, especially of competition and predator-prey interactions. So in the upper intertidal, you're exposed a lot of the time. Some of these are barely ever wet. Some of them, they may just get sprayed by the waves crash, and there's the sea spray. That's how they get wet. They're not even underwater. So that's quite a difference between the organism we're going to see in the lower intertidal, where they're experiencing submergence almost all the time. So it's cold, it gets hot, it gets cold, you're in the air. Temperature changes on land a lot faster than in the water. There's predators that are coming along and feeding on you. These terrestrial predators, the raccoons, or birds, or some kind of terrestrial predator that can come down. Humans can come down and feed on you when you're exposed. When you're underwater, it's relatively safe from terrestrial predators. And so you've got to be able to tolerate drastic temperature changes. You've got to be able to tolerate desiccation, loss of water, salinity changes that are associated with that. And so what do you find up there? In terms of primary producers, there's a lot of cyanobacteria, this blue-green algae, prokaryotic photosynthesizer that we looked at earlier in the semester. You find lichens, which you might think that's an unusual primary producer to find in a marine ecosystem. And green algae, a lot of green algae. And in terms of the organisms there's some mollusks. There's a lot of snails that breathe air. They can extract oxygen out of the air, which is another thing that you have to do. Underwater, it's easy to extract oxygen for most of these invertebrates. It's a whole other challenge to extract oxygen from the air. And so there's crustaceans that are crawling around that are air breathers, basically. And so there's a niche for you to fill. If you can tolerate those conditions, you can scramble around on the rocks. You can attach yourself to the rocks. And you can take advantage of those the short period of time when there's food available, or you can collect food by moving around. You can graze on algae. There's a lot of barnacles up there that they're stuck to the rocks. They're fine with this challenge of keeping your position on the rocks when waves are crashing on you. They have a very short period of time during which they can feed, but when they're underwater, they can open their shells, they can stick their feeding apparatus out, and they can wave it through the water, and they can gather food for that short period of time. When the water goes down, they close their shells, and they can tolerate those conditions of temperature, salinity, desiccation. So what do you find up there around here? There's barnacles, a lot of the Littorina snails that are all over the place. I don't want to make you feel bad about not being able to go on these field trips, but if we were able to go on these field trips, one of the things you would have seen by the hundreds and thousands would be these Littorina snails in the rocky shore in Rhode Island. Blue-green algae, green algae, these primary producers. So environmental factors are the big thing. When you move closer to the water, we'll see this again and again, that biological features, biological factors, ability to compete, ability to latch onto the rocks and carve out a niche there becomes more and more important. So here's there's a picture of where we would go in Rhode Island for the rocky shore. There's a diagram that shows the type of zonation that you see. There's lichens, and there's these periwinkles, or the Littorina snails. There's barnacles. So that upper part, the splash zone and the high tide zone, that's where we're talking about. And that's what we would see. If you go to the rocky shore sometime, you see there's this upper zone with those characteristics, physical characteristics, stressful habitat to be able to occupy. Those are the types of organisms that can tolerate and thrive under those stressful conditions. In the middle intertidal zone, now here you're underwater more. There's a lot more opportunity to obtain food when you're underwater, to obtain oxygen when you're underwater, to avoid desiccation, to avoid those drastic temperature changes. It's getting easier to live here. This is a place where there's a lot of wave action. The waves are literally crashing on you, and so you have got to have some mechanism for attaching to the rocks. It's getting easier and easier to live there, so you've got to be a better competitor. You're not just going to get by being a very good stress tolerator, but you've got to be able to compete. The mechanism for dealing with waves crashing, you've got to be able to attach yourself to the rocks very well, very securely. You've got to be able to bend in the waves if you're something like an algae. And you've got to be a better competitor. So what kind of organisms are able to tolerate those conditions? Not just tolerate those conditions, but thrive under those conditions. what kind of organisms are able to be pretty good competitors, but have some level of ability to tolerate stress when they're out of the water. Well, what you see, there's a lot of mussels and there's a lot of barnacles. These barnacles we saw in the upper intertidal, but there's different species of barnacles that aren't such good stress tolerators, but they're better competitors. And then there's starfish or sea stars, there's chitons, there's limpets, there's urchins, there's a lot of snails. So those kind of organisms we find in the middle intertidal. So they're better competitors, not as good at eking out, carving out an existence where you can tolerate a lot of stressful conditions. And so you see a lot of barnacles, and you start to see mussels. Sometimes it looks like there's a band, like someone went there and put up a little fence between the barnacles and the mussels, because the barnacles stop and then the mussels start. So depending on where you are and the species that are there, you can have a band of barnacles, and just below that you have a band of mussels. So here you see there's the water in this figure, and underwater life is easy there. Above the water, you're in the middle intertidal once you get up a little ways, and then it's below the upper intertidal where the conditions start to be more harsh. So you're a good competitor and with some ability to tolerate stress. So in Rhode Island and some other places, what do you find in the middle intertidal? You find starfish, sea stars. You find brown algae with these floats and being able to tolerate wave action. You find barnacles that are good competitors. You find a lot of mussels, and it's a race. It's a competition to find a little space where you can attach yourself to the rocks. And so algae trying to attach themselves to the rocks. Barnacles are trying to attach themselves to the rocks. Mussels are trying to attach themselves to the rocks. And those are all permanently attached. For things that are moving around like urchins and starfish, they've also got to be able to attach themselves to the rocks. Some urchins bore into the rock, the substrate, coralline algae, and they carve out a little indentation for them to be able to stay in. But they're mobile. They're moving around, and so it's not such a premium on finding a spot and attaching yourself to the rocks that way. In the lower intertidal, now this is where life is easy in terms of these physical conditions. You don't have to deal with temperature. You don't have to deal with the desiccation. You can feed almost all the time. You can extract oxygen from the water almost all the time. You're only out of the water for a short period of time. You're still in the intertidal, by definition being out of the water some of the time. So you spend a little bit of your time out of the water, or in this unusual situation for marine organisms where you're not in the ocean anymore. And so the ability to tolerate those extreme conditions isn't such a premium. What becomes the big driving force for what you find there and what you don't find there is ability to compete. Good competitors, good ability to tolerate predator-prey interactions. And so you find different types of primary producers. You find red algae, you find brown algae, dominant. Not so much green algae, blue-green algae, those kind of things. The seaweed, there's a lot of seaweed. They can attach themselves there, and they don't have to deal with these extreme environmental conditions. They're good competitors. When they're underwater, the level of light and the wavelengths of light are fine for them to be able to photosynthesize. Go a little farther deeper into the water, and maybe there becomes more and more brown algae. But in this lower intertidal, it's a mixture. You find both of these. There's a lot of organisms that feed on that algae. They're going along scraping algae off the rocks. So they're feeding on algae. So you've got to be able to attach yourself to the rocks. There's a lot of filter feeders that come out when they're underwater and wave their feeding structures through the water and filter things out of the water. There's other things that crawl along on the rocks, like urchins and and starfish. And there's these tide pools that I mentioned before. These tide pools are distinct habitats that experience really drastic changes sometimes. As I mentioned before, if you're in a tide pool, you're thinking, okay, this is good. I'm in a tide pool, very protected, but the water doesn't come up high enough to replenish the supply of water. The tide doesn't come up high enough, but the waves don't crash high enough. You're in this tide pool that's evaporating, and it's becoming less and less water, more and more saline. Or maybe there's a big storm, and this tide pool that you're in, that was a very good environment, is filled up with fresh water. And now the salinity has changed drastically. It's a whole different set of environmental conditions and challenges for organisms to live in. These tide pools are really interesting to look at. You can go there. It's like a little aquarium on the rocks, and people are fascinated looking at these tide pools. So you see organisms that are very good at tolerating those conditions there in these tide pools. Well, what do you find in the lower intertidal? As I said, there's things that are very good at competing, very good at attaching to the rocks. Brown algae, green algae, or brown algae and red algae, good competitors, primary producers. Things that eat algae, other predators like starfish, and the filter feeders that latch onto the rocks, and that's going to be their home. When the water comes up, they filter feed, they extract oxygen, and remove wastes. It's fine. Around here, you find some brittle stars, you find algae, you find our urchins, you find a number of different mollusks. There's sea slugs that you can find sometimes. So this lower intertidal zone in Rhode Island, there's some interesting organisms you find there, and a variety of these that we looked at, echinoderms, mollusks, the different groups that we looked at. And if we went to the rocky shore, you're going to have to do this on your own, obviously, but if you went there and you started walking down on the rocky shore, within a matter of seconds, you would start seeing things like mollusks, gasopod mollusks. If you looked more closely, you'd start to see some echinoderms, a lot of echinoderms. You'd see some of these algae, and you'd see some other echinoderms, like the brittle stars maybe, and some other types of mollusks. So very interesting place, very dynamic, a lot of niches to be filled, a lot of diversity, a lot of ecological interactions going on. It's a very interesting place to look at, well studied, as I said. So that takes us through these intertidal ecosystems. Now we could spend a long time talking about that. Now there's a class that's being taught at URI on basically intertidal ecosystems. So obviously you can spend a whole semester looking at what's going on there.